Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, a bit of a different style of video, probably more towards beginner players, but for us kind of players who have played SuperCoach for a little bit longer than that, it might be worthwhile getting a refresh on the vice captain loophole. Just wanted to outline and explain how it works, because I know this is a very common question that a lot of beginner players do have, so I thought it might be useful in the pre-season just to knock this one out. If you enjoyed the video, really appreciate a thumbs up. Do please consider subscribing to the channel as well if you haven't already, and let's get straight into it. So some brief tips on actually using the vice captain loophole and when is actually the best time to be using it. So it's actually not the best to be used in the early parts of the season, mainly because in the early rounds of the year, we are looking to try to build up our overall squad value. And so we've got a lot of players, generally, we might have a 23, 24, or even a 25-man squad who are all going to be playing players. We probably won't have any non-playing reserves at the start of the season as we're trying to build our squad value. When we get into the mechanics of the vice captain loophole, it requires you to actually get an auto emergency score, which is the lowest playing non-reserved player on your squad. And they normally have the very low scores, and especially at the beginning of the season when we're going to have, cheap center wings, cheap props who are off the bench, we're probably not going to get very nice auto emergency scores, so it's actually not as useful in the early parts of the season. Now, it is actually more effective during the bye rounds, which are going to be rounds 13 and I believe 17 this season. It just means because in those bye rounds, we're going to have half the teams not playing, you have less players available. Therefore, that risk of a really awful auto emergency score is lower. So during those bye rounds, it's a nice time to be using the vice captain loophole. Alternatively, at the back end of the season, when we're trying to build out a strong 17 and have less of those kind of auto emergency players, that's also a good time to be using the vice captain loophole. So it is worthwhile to note how to actually do it, but just noting that during the early parts of the season, it's not as much of an issue. And one final tip is that to make the vice captain loophole work, your vice captain should be playing before your captain. So any new players out there, what tends to happen is after each game, there will be a score correction or an update as they do a second round of checking on the NRL stats from the game. Therefore, there can be some score updates that happen around maybe a day or two after each game. Therefore, it's nice to have your vice captain play earlier just so you can allow for potentially any kind of score updates, and that can help you actually decide when you actually want to play the vice captain loophole. So those are some of my general tips. I think next what I'll get onto, I'll actually just demonstrate this in practice on the actual NRL SuperCoach page. So guys, I've just jumped onto the NRL SuperCoach page, and I think I just wanted to show, it'll be easier showing on the actual page with my team. It's the same team that I had in my preseason draft video. I haven't made any changes now. So just to best demonstrate the vice captain loophole. And I think what's also very important to note, just below me, you can see the order of games in each particular round. So they're showing the games for round 1. What is important, as I just mentioned in the previous section, is that your vice captain actually plays earlier in the round, and that's to allow for score updates and corrections to give you a better sense of, is playing the vice captain loophole actually going to be worth it. So you can see that the Panthers play on Thursday. So at the moment, I've got Nathan Cleary as my vice captain because he plays early in the round. And you know what? I think Tedesco could be a good captaincy shout, say, against the Knights. And just also pointing out the scores that are next to each player's name. I've just used the SC Plus projected points tool. I don't necessarily trust these scores that much, but for the purposes of this example, I will show that. So in order to determine is a vice captain loophole going to be worth it in a particular situation, let's say for example, Cleary scores 150. He can definitely do that in any particular round. So let's say I'm concerned maybe Tedesco, there's a bit of an injury cloud around him. Maybe there's a risk of, him getting injured, in early part of the game against the Knights. Maybe the 150 points from Cleary, I just want to bank it. So therefore, I want to play my vice captain loophole. So what's very important to note is that to do the vice captain loophole, you need to then put your captaincy armband onto a player who's 100% not going to play. This is the only way the vice captain is going to be triggered into a captaincy or double points for Cleary. Your captain has to not play a single minute or be not involved at all in the game. Even if your player plays and scores 0, it's not going to work. So let's just say, looking at my team, I scroll up, I can see Harry Grant. Harry Grant is a perfect candidate for this because you can see that below me the Storm won't play until after the Roosters or after the Panthers, so I have time to decide is it actually worth doing it, and I can use Harry Grant as my kind of loophole candidate as it is, and I know for sure he's not going to play in round 1 because he's suspended. So he looks a perfect candidate. I could also maybe go for someone like a Piakura, or maybe scrolling down, I could go for one of my center wings as well. Now, going for your center wings could be ideal, but just looking at the projected points as well, it seems like Chris Randall actually has the lowest in comparison to some of my center wings there. I'll look to maybe drop out Chris Randall for Harry Grant. So Nathan Cleary's got 150 points. I want to bank those points. So what I would do then is I would sub in Harry Grant for Chris Randall, and then I would actually make Harry Grant my captain. And so now that I've made Harry Grant my captain, I could still keep my 4 reserves as they are, Bullimore, Ilias, Amon, and then Pappenhausen. But let's say, for example, you really actually wanted to play Chris Randall. Maybe you take the reserve off one of your other reserves. So let's say, for example, I take the reserve off Amon, and I just put it back on Chris Randall just because I think he might, Randall might perform better than Amon. Now I've changed my starting 17, and you can make these changes throughout the round because of the rolling lockout. You just have to make sure that these changes work in terms of when your vice captain and your captain play. So for example, I'm okay to do this because my vice captain plays early in the round on the Thursday. The people that I'm swapping out, so say like Amon, Chris Randall and Harry Grant, you can see that the Dragons won't play till Saturday 5:30, same time as well for the Knights, and then the Storm don't actually play until 7:30 on the Saturday. So I've got all of say Friday to make that decision if I want to make those particular substitutions. And so the final thing to note is that because I've subbed in Harry Grant as my captain, the game is going to recognize that one player in my starting 17 hasn't actually played. Therefore, I'm going to be getting my auto emergency. So the auto emergency, you can see the players who aren't highlighted in purple, the likes of Moroa, Momosia, Piakura, Howarth, Amon, Suwali, Tass, and Kay. Those are all my non-playing reserves. And so what the auto emergency is you're going to get your lowest scoring non-player reserve. And so looking at the projected points, I'm going to ignore Piakura because he's going to be out for round 1. Let's say, for example, it's Moroa. And you can see he's got a projected points of 16, which is the lowest out of those other non-playing reserves. You also have to factor in that you're dropping Amon from your starting 17 to do the light loophole, but then you're gaining, 16 points from Aroa as my lowest playing auto emergency. So you can see now why, in the early parts of the season when you've got a lot of these cheap players filling out your squad, sometimes they might come on for like 10-15 minutes and score like 5-10 points, and then it makes the vice captain loophole very unattractive. The final point before we actually look at calculating if the vice captain loophole is worth it, I'll look at James Tedesco. So he's actually the player who I dropped as my captain, and so according to SC Plus projected points, he's going to score 85. So let's keep all of those numbers in mind. I'm now gaining Nathan Cleary vice captain, 150 points. I'm losing Amon's 32 points, I'm gaining Moroa's 16 points, and I'm losing 85 points of what would have been my normal captaincy in Tedesco. And so a great way to figure out, was all of that worth it? A vice captain loophole calculator. There's one on NRL SuperCoach stats. It's a fantastic website. It's where I get all my stats from. Great guys running a fantastic website. So let's say, for example, my vice captain scored 150, and that's what I'm actually looking to bank those double points. And let's say my normal captain, which was Tedesco, gets his 85. The dropped player that I lost from doing the loophole was Amon, and so he scored 32. And my AE was Moroa, and he scored 16 points. So just plug those numbers in, press submit, and so you can see there, after doing all of those calculations, my looped points was 401, and my no looped points was 352. So I actually gained around 50 points from doing that vice captain loophole. And so that would be a time where it was worth it doing it. And so you can see it kind of actually makes the gap a lot closer than you think. Even though Nathan Cleary scored 150 and Tedesco scored 85, because of all the sub-ins and sub-outs that we had to do, it makes the gap a little bit closer. So definitely recommend double checking any vice captain loophole calculations before you actually do it. So let's just quickly reset the team. So this is a brief example of doing the vice captain loophole and where it actually works out for you. Let's say, for example, though, Nathan Cleary only scored 84 and Tedesco scored 85. If maybe I did it a different way, so say for example, instead of using Harry Grant as my substitution, maybe I use one of my centre wings, which could be a more preferred way, given that centre wings scoring tends to be a little bit more volatile. So let's say for example, if Tass is not going to play round 1, he's out of the squad completely, so basically he's enough essentially. Let's say I sub out Targo because he's got the lowest projected score of 33. So I'd sub out Targo, I'd bring in Tass. Now, obviously, I could decide whether to keep the reserve on Amon or maybe I'd switch it to Targo. So I'll do that same thing that I did in the previous example just to keep it consistent. And I put the reserve back on Targo, and then similarly, I would take the captaincy off Tedesco and I would put it on Isaiah Tass, knowing that he's not going to play at all. Now, obviously, you can note that the Rabbitohs do actually play on the Friday. So it's a day before that previous scenario that I showed, so it might not be as ideal. So what I have done in this case is I've taken off, say, Tedesco's 85, I've taken away Amon's 32, and again, I'm going to be adding back in that 16-point AE from Moroa, and let's say in this case, instead of the 84, let's say Cleary gets 120, or let's say 120. So let's say Nathan Cleary gets 120 points. Tedesco maintained is 85. Let's say I dropped Amon's 32, and I'm still going to be getting the AE of 16 points. Now you can see there, the looped points of 341 still does outscore 322. So this is when it gets tight like this is when you kind of need to decide, looking at your non-playing reserves, do you think that Moroa could make up that 20-point gap? I think your auto emergency is going to deliver a decent score, maybe say 25, 30 plus. That probably is enough grounds to go for a vice captain loophole. But if you think, if there's just someone who's on your bench who might come on for say 10 minutes a game and score like 5-10 points, then it might make it a little bit more difficult whether you actually go for the vice captain loophole. So as a general rule of thumb, I try to use like 130 as a benchmark as to whether I actually want to play the vice captain loophole. Although last season I played a vice captain loophole on Cody Walker of 150 points, and that didn't work out well for me because that was the same week that Tom Tavorovich scored 225, I want to say. So I feel like the bar has been raised a little bit more on terms of when you actually play your vice captain loophole, but hopefully that made some sense. I know it sounded a little bit back and forth. Definitely let me know in the comments below, if you found that, useful, or if it was a little bit complicated. If you found it a little bit complicated, I'm happy to demonstrate or even redo the video just to help you guys out, because it can be very, very confusing, but hopefully you guys found some value out of that and, actually improved your understanding of how to do the vice captain loophole. So thanks all for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Really appreciate a thumbs up as always. Consider subscribing if you do enjoy the content, and see you all in the next video.